The Quiet Panic. This is a story that I've been putting off telling for over 2 years now. Every time I think about that cabin, about what I found when I woke up, I get this sick feeling in my stomach that just won't go away. But you guys have been asking for more wilderness horror stories, and honestly, this one tops every scary experience I've ever had in the backcountry. It was late September and I had just finished a brutal week of midterms at college. My roommate Jake and I decided we needed to get away from campus, away from everything, just to decompress. We'd been planning this weekend camping trip for months, talking about finding some remote spot where we could disconnect from the world and maybe do some fishing. Jake had heard about this area from his older brother, who said there were these old hunting cabins scattered throughout the forest that hikers could use if they got caught in bad weather. The plan was simple. We'd drive out Friday afternoon, hike about 6 miles into the wilderness, set up camp somewhere near one of the small lakes, and spend the weekend just chilling. What we didn't plan for was the weather turning absolutely miserable on Friday night. By the time we reached our intended campsite, it was pouring rain. The temperature had dropped into the 30s and the wind was howling through the trees like something out of a horror movie. That's when Jake remembered what his brother had told him about the cabins. We pulled out our map, and sure enough, there was supposed to be an old hunting cabin about 1.5 miles from where we were standing. At that point, we were both soaked to the bone and starting to shiver, so we made the decision to head for the cabin instead of trying to set up our tent in that weather. The hike to the cabin was absolutely brutal. The trail was muddy and slippery, and with the rain coming down so hard, we could barely see 10 feet in front of us. Our headlamps kept fogging up, and every few minutes one of us would slip and nearly fall face first into the mud. But after what felt like forever, we finally saw this dark shape through the trees. The cabin was exactly what you'd expect from an old hunting lodge. It was made of weathered logs, probably built sometime in the 70s or 80s, with a small covered porch and a chimney sticking out of a metal roof. The windows were dark, and there were no cars or any other signs that anyone else was using it. We walked up to the front door and Jake tried the handle. It was unlocked. We stepped inside and immediately felt relieved to be out of that storm. The cabin was small but cozy, with a main room that had a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, and what looked like 2 bedrooms toward the back. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust, like nobody had been there in months. There was a logbook on a table near the door where people were supposed to sign in, and the last entry was from early July. Jake found some old firewood stacked next to the fireplace, and within about 20 minutes we had a decent fire going. We hung our wet clothes on chairs around the fireplace and changed into dry gear from our packs. For the first time since we'd left campus, we were actually comfortable. We cooked some ramen on our camp stove, shared a few beers, and talked about how we'd gotten lucky finding this place. Around 10 o'clock, we decided to check out the bedrooms. The first one had 2 twin beds with old mattresses that looked like they'd seen better days. The second bedroom was smaller, with just 1 bed, but it looked cleaner somehow. Jake said he'd take the room with 2 beds and I could have the single. We were both exhausted from the hike and the stress of midterms, so we agreed to call it an early night. I settled into the small bedroom and was surprised by how comfortable the bed was. The mattress was old, but not lumpy, and there were clean sheets and blankets in a cedar chest at the foot of the bed. The rain was still pounding on the roof, but it was actually kind of soothing now that we were warm and dry. I remember thinking that this was going to be the best night's sleep I'd had in weeks, but that's when things started feeling off. As I was lying there trying to fall asleep, I kept hearing these weird noises coming from somewhere in the cabin. At first, I thought it was just the old building settling, or maybe the wind causing the walls to creak. But the sounds were too regular, too rhythmic. It almost sounded like footsteps, but slow and deliberate, like someone was trying to be quiet. I called out to Jake, asking if he was still awake, but he didn't answer. I figured he'd already fallen asleep, which wouldn't surprise me since he'd been complaining about being tired for the entire hike. The footstep sounds continued for maybe 10 more minutes, then stopped completely. The cabin went silent except for the rain on the roof. I must have drifted off sometime after midnight because the next thing I remember is waking up to complete silence. The rain had stopped, and there was this eerie stillness that you only get in the deep woods. I checked my phone, and it was just after 6 in the morning. I felt surprisingly rested considering everything we'd been through the night before. I got out of bed and walked toward the main room to see if Jake was awake yet. But as soon as I stepped out of the bedroom, I froze. There, in the middle of the main room floor, was a dark stain that definitely hadn't been there when we went to bed. It was roughly circular, maybe 3 feet across, and it looked wet. In the dim morning light filtering through the windows, it was hard to tell exactly what it was, but something about it made my stomach drop. I walked closer, and that's when I realized what I was looking at. It was blood. Fresh blood. The kind that's still tacky to the touch, like it had been there for only a few hours. There was so much of it, way more than you'd get from a small cut or nosebleed. This looked like someone had been seriously injured or worse. My first thought was that Jake had gotten hurt somehow. Maybe fallen and hit his head during the night. I rushed to his bedroom and pushed open the door, expecting to find him injured or unconscious. But his bed was empty. Not just empty like he'd gotten up early, but empty like he'd never slept in it at all. The covers were still perfectly made, exactly how we'd found them the night before. I called out his name, checking the small kitchen area, the bathroom, even looking in the closets. Nothing. Jake was gone, and there was no sign of where he might have went. His backpack was still in his room, his clothes were still hanging by the fireplace, even his hiking boots were sitting right where he'd left them by the front door. That's when the panic really started to set in. I grabbed my phone and tried calling him, but there was no signal this deep in the woods. I ran outside, hoping maybe he'd just stepped out to use the bathroom or something, but the forest was completely quiet. No signs of Jake anywhere. I went back inside and stood there staring at that bloodstain, trying to make sense of what had happened. The blood was definitely fresh, and there was way too much of it to ignore. But if Jake was hurt, where was he? And if he wasn't hurt, whose blood was it? That's when I noticed something else that made my blood run cold. There were footprints in the blood. Not Jake's footprints, but something else entirely. They were larger than human feet with what looked like claw marks at the tips. And they led from the center of the bloodstain straight to the front door of the cabin. I followed those tracks outside, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The prints were clear in the mud from the previous night's rain, leading away from the cabin and into the thick woods. But here's what really freaked me out. They weren't consistent. Sometimes they looked almost human, just bigger than normal feet. Other times they had these deep gouges that could only come from claws. I knew I should pack up and get out of there immediately, but I couldn't just leave without knowing what happened to Jake. We'd been best friends since freshman year, and the thought of abandoning him in the middle of nowhere made me sick. So against every instinct screaming at me to run, I decided to follow the tracks. The trail led deeper into the forest, winding between massive pine trees and overfallen logs. I kept calling Jake's name, hoping to hear his voice echo back through the woods. But the only response was the sound of my own voice bouncing off the trees, getting weaker each time until it faded into nothing. After about 20 minutes of following the tracks, they led to a small clearing where the morning sunlight was filtering through the canopy. That's where I found Jake's shirt. It was torn to shreds, hanging from a low branch like someone had ripped it right off his body. The fabric was stained with the same dark blood I'd found in the cabin. I grabbed the shirt and examined it more closely. The tears weren't from branches or thorns. They were too clean, too deliberate. It looked like something with very sharp claws had sliced through the material. And there was so much blood soaked into the fabric that I knew Jake had to be seriously injured if he was even still alive. The tracks continued past the clearing, but they were getting harder to follow as the ground became rockier. I kept pushing forward, checking my phone every few minutes, hoping for a signal. But we were still too deep in the wilderness. My battery was starting to drain from constantly searching for service, and I realized I needed to make a decision soon. That's when I heard it. A low rumbling sound coming from somewhere ahead of me. It wasn't quite a growl, but it definitely wasn't human. It sounded like something large moving through the underbrush, and it was getting closer. I crouched behind a fallen tree and tried to control my breathing, listening for any other sounds that might tell me what I was dealing with. The noise stopped for a few seconds, then started again, but this time it was moving in a circle around where I was hiding. Whatever was out there knew I was there, and it was stalking me. I could hear branches breaking and leaves rustling as it moved, but I couldn't see anything through the thick vegetation. Then I heard something that made my blood freeze. It was Jake's voice, but something was wrong with it. He was calling my name, but his voice sounded strained, like he was in pain or being forced to speak. The voice was coming from the direction of the circling sounds, and I realized that whatever was out there had Jake with it. I stood up slowly, trying to see through the trees, and called back to him. For a moment, everything went silent. Then Jake's voice came again, but this time it was different. It sounded more desperate, more urgent, like he was trying to warn me about something. But I couldn't make out the words clearly. Against every survival instinct I had, I started moving toward the sound of his voice. I had to help him no matter what was out there. But as I got closer, Jake's voice started sounding strange. almost like it was echoing or being distorted somehow. The words became clearer, and that's when I realized what he was saying. He was telling me to run. I heard crashing sounds through the woods like something large was charging in my direction. I turned and sprinted back toward the cabin as fast as I could, jumping over logs and dodging between trees. Behind me, I could hear whatever it was giving chase, breaking through branches and underbrush like it was nothing. I made it back to the cabin and slammed the door behind me, immediately pushing the heavy wooden table against it to barricade myself inside. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get my phone out to try calling for help again. But there was still no signal. I spent the next 3 hours in that cabin listening to sounds outside that I still can't fully explain. Sometimes it sounded like something was walking around the building, testing the windows and doors. Other times I'd hear Jake's voice calling to me, begging me to come outside and help him. But something about the voice wasn't right, and I knew in my gut that whatever was out there wasn't really Jake anymore. When I finally worked up the courage to look out the window, I saw something that will haunt me for the rest of my life. There was a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, just barely visible in the shadows between the trees. It was tall, much taller than Jake, but it was wearing his clothes, or what was left of them. The thing stood there for maybe 10 minutes, perfectly still, like it was waiting for me to come outside. Then it melted back into the forest, and I didn't see it again. I waited until the sun was high in the sky before I finally gathered the courage to leave that cabin. I packed up everything, including Jake's gear, and hiked out of there as fast as I could. When I reached the trailhead, I immediately called the police and reported Jake missing. The search and rescue team spent 4 days combing those woods, but they never found any trace of him. No body, no more clothing, nothing. The official report listed him as a missing person, presumed dead due to exposure or animal attack. But I know what really happened out there, and it wasn't any normal animal. I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night thinking I can hear Jake's voice calling my name from somewhere far away. And every time I see blood, even just a small cut, I'm right back in that cabin, staring at that dark stain on the floor and wondering what kind of thing could make a person disappear without leaving anything behind but their torn, bloody clothes. If you're ever hiking in remote areas and you come across an old hunting cabin, my advice is simple. Keep walking. Some places are abandoned for a reason, and some things are better left undisturbed in the deep woods where they belong.